Okay, everyone. Well, I think we're up to about 40 folks, and I think this is a good chance to go ahead and kick off today's program. But hey, thank you so much for spending your lunch breaks with us here today. My name is Will Glasco. I'm the new CEO of Preservation Virginia here in Richmond. I'm in our office, which is the historic Coal Digs House here off of Franklin Street. But we definitely have a good crowd here today. I think there's some real interest in the upcoming General Assembly session and possible legislation and budget amendments affecting historic preservation and land conservation. So just a couple of quick housekeeping things before we move forward. Please tell us where you're tuning in from in the chat. We'd love to know who folks are with, your organizations, and what part of the Commonwealth you might be tuning in from. Being a statewide organization, we love to see a lot of geographic diversity and how our friends and supporters, where they live and work, where they're coming from. But also, if you have questions about today's presentations, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screens. You can enter your questions there, and we're going to save those for the end. After the presentations, we'll go through and have your questions answered by our expert panel here. So just a little bit of background for y'all. I thought I would set a little bit of context about Preservation Virginia and our role in this type of advocacy work here in the Commonwealth. We were founded back in 1889, and methods for preservation were very different in those days. Basically, you had to buy a property in order to save it. The idea was there weren't a lot of tools in the historic preservation toolbox in terms of how to go out and preserve historic viewsheds or landscapes and things like that. Basically, APVA was formed to go out and buy threatened properties that were deemed at the time as being particularly unique or important so that we could save them for future generations. At one time, we owned up to about 40 properties around the state. We've curated that list down just a little bit. At this point, we have 6 sites that are open to the public, which include Bacon's Castle and Smith's Fort in Surrey, the John Marshall House here in Richmond, Patrick Henry Scotchtown in Hanover County, Cape Henry Lighthouse in Virginia Beach, and of course, historic Jamestown. In the early 2000s, there were 2 historic preservation groups here in Virginia, 2 statewide groups. There was the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, US, and the Preservation Alliance of Virginia. The Preservation Alliance focused a little bit more on advocacy and public outreach, whereas again, APVA was a little bit more of a property owning group. But in 2002, we decided to merge those 2 organizations to create one unified voice for historic preservation here in Virginia. That offered more opportunity to focus our messaging, get everyone on the same page, but also make it a little bit easier for our donors and supporters to essentially support the museums that we steward and our advocacy program with one gift, as it were. So it's sort of simplified the preservation landscape with nonprofits here in Virginia. As a result, we run programs like the annual list of Virginia's most endangered historic places, which is released each May. Applications for that or nominations will come open in January, and we hope y'all will consider threatened sites in your communities that you can nominate to that program. We also host an award ceremony on the flip side of things to honor successful preservation projects and folks doing the research. That's held each September. And in a sense, we become a call center, essentially a preservation call center for folks with issues in their communities. We have an expert team of community engagement staff and a restoration team who can go out and advise on issues that pop up in their community. So it's really a robust and well-rounded organization in that sense. But we work very, very closely with our friends at the Department of Historic Resources, really the state version of us. We're the private nonprofit, and DHR is the state arm of historic preservation. I think this partnership is very important, that we're working together to advocate for and do what we can on a statewide level to preserve the places that make our state unique. And with that, I would like to introduce Julie Langan, who's the director of the Department of Historic Resources and the State Historic Preservation Officer. Julie, we'd love for you to share some information from us about what DHR is expecting in the upcoming General Assembly session and what we're hoping will come about as a result.
Great. If you want to show the first slides, I'd be happy to do that. And thank you to Preservation Virginia for hosting this again this year. I think this is a really effective way of preparing all of us for the upcoming session. And as Will said, we do enjoy a very close partnership, the Department of Historic Resources and Preservation Virginia. And DHR really relies on Preservation Virginia to help advocate for the resources that our preservation programs really need. So, Will, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll just start off by addressing the department's budget requests this year. For those of you who aren't familiar with the budget process, it actually starts a lot earlier than you might expect. We've been working on our budget requests since June, and that involves putting forward requests both for funding and legislation and working with our cabinet secretary, Travis Voiles, to vet our requests. And at this point in time, everything is outside of my control, and I don't know what will make it into the governor's budget when it's released on December 18th. So I'd like to just summarize for you what we have asked for. If you want detailed information about any of these requests, you can go to the Department of Planning and Budget website, and they're there in great detail. And then I'm also going to speak just a little bit to our grant programs in a few minutes. So to talk about the requests, they really fall into four categories. And the first is operations. And I've listed these in our order of priority because we are asked to prioritize. So for us, operations are our number one priority. Our current state appropriation is not keeping pace with inflation and our increasing operational costs. Like all of you, costs go up. Our rent has gone up. Pretty much everything has gone up. So we're now experiencing a tighter budget than we had over the last couple of years. When we subtract from our general fund appropriation, our fixed costs for rent, personnel, information technology that we have to procure through VITA, we're left with about 1.35% to cover everything else. And that's just not enough. The way we've managed that in the last year or two is because we have had a number of vacancies. And so we've been saving some of our personnel cost, but we've been actively working to fill those vacancies. So we're not going to have the ability to use salaries to cover some of our basic operational expenses. That's why this is our number one request. So what are we asking for? Well, in the second year of this current budget, we're asking for operations a total of $820,000. $315,000 of that is a one-time cost for conservation lab equipment. One-time costs are more appealing than recurring costs. So that is something that, I always keep in mind when putting these requests together. And then the rest of it is really for increased staff support for personnel, about $200,000 for personnel, about $100,000 to cover some programmatic costs associated with our cost share and threatened sites programs, and then $100,000 to cover the increase in our rent. That would be in this next year. What we've asked for on an ongoing basis is $450,000. That would be a recurring part of our general fund. So number one request, operations, to help bridge that gap between our expenses and our general fund appropriation. Then we're also asking for funding for some information technology enhancements. We've asked for this a number of times and not received funding for it, but DHR used to be ahead of our sister SHPOs when it came to data management and electronic project submissions, but in recent years, we've actually really fallen behind. And we need to invest in integrating VCRIS, which is the Cultural Resources Database, with EPICS, which is the Electronic Project Submission system. And currently, these are two standalone systems, but were we able to integrate them, it would result in significant efficiencies for DHR staff as well as our external users who really rely on these two mission critical systems. So we're requesting $160,000 in the upcoming year and $90,000 on an ongoing basis to fund these enhancements. And in addition to getting those two systems coordinated and speaking to one another, we also would like to develop and maintain a digital asset management system. We have records in VCRIS on over 280,000 historic properties. And we have about 1 million digitized images, documents, and data sets. So with this volume of information, and it's increasing every single year, we want to make that more available to the public and to those who use this information. So we would like to develop this digital asset system to make those materials more available. And then finally, under the heading of IT, we have transitioned to a web-based grant application system, and we need some support for that on an ongoing basis. It's creating all kinds of efficiencies, both for people applying for grants and also for the staff who manage them. And then third, we have made a request for funding for NAGPRA. We are asking for $125,000 in this next year and annually thereafter to fund a person, so that the department can become fully compliant with the recently issued revisions to the Federal Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And that takes a person who understands NAGPRA, who can interface with the tribes and can work with what we estimate to be probably about 8,000 NAGPRA eligible artifacts. So this is a multi-year effort so that we properly consult with tribes regarding these artifacts, and we make plans together to properly repatriate human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects back to the tribes with cultural patrimony. The last thing on this slide is revised budget language regarding our tribal internship program. We're not asking for additional funding. What we're asking for is a change in language. Right now, we receive $50,000 a year for tribal interns, but we don't attract as many interns as, we can't spend $50,000 on interns because there aren't that many who spend time with us. What we would like to do is have the flexibility to use that money on other tribal initiatives, consultation, small grants, but we can't do that without a change in budget language. Well, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll just say a few words about grants. I don't know if we will receive any additional grant funding. I have not requested any. We administer the African American Cemeteries and Graves Fund, and that has been receiving $250,000 a year in funding. But last year was the first year that we actually hit that number, and we will continue to add eligible cemeteries to the program, and there will not be enough money to go around as we continue to add cemeteries. So I wouldn't be surprised if perhaps a member of the General Assembly won't put forward a budget amendment to address that. Likewise, I don't know what to expect when it comes to Virginia 250. We have had an incredible response to the first and only expected round of funding for this special fund that is tied to the semi-quincentennial. We received 227 pre-applications that totaled $137 million. We have 20 million to award. And of those pre-applications, most of them were for eligible projects, and the applicants were eligible recipients. But when it came time to actually submit the full applications, we only received 166, and the number came down to 95 million. So we don't have enough money to address the needs that are out there from the various organizations preparing for the uptick in visitation that we all expect in 2026. It's possible that the governor may add some funding for Virginia 250 to his budget, and if not, maybe a member would do that. Finally, with BIPOC, again, I don't know what to expect. We have done a first round of funding of 2.5 million. We have enough left, 3.5, to do another round. Last year, the governor put $1 million in his budget that I didn't expect. It was a surprise. That could happen again or not. If it doesn't, it could be that a member puts in a budget amendment, and Virginia Forever has made a part of its legislative priorities the recommendation of recurring $5 million a year funding for this program. So we appreciate their support. And then lastly, I'll just mention that we receive sometimes not as many pass-through grants that result from members putting in budget amendments for specific projects. This year we have 15 of those, and they total almost $13 million. We have no control over those. They aren't things that we request. Those are appropriations made in response to member requests. So that is, in a nutshell, what DHR has requested and what we think could possibly be included in the budget when it comes to grants. Some of you, I hope many of you, are familiar with a study that was done a couple years ago that looked at the historic preservation tax credit, the state tax credit. And that was a partnership between the Department of Historic Resources and Preservation Virginia. We do this every 5 to 6 years, and we try to have up-to-date information available when looking forward to a new session of our state legislature so that we can make the case for how impactful this credit really is. We can all be proud of the fact that Virginia truly has the best state tax credit in the entire country. And I think Tripp is going to say a little bit about the impact of that and why it's so important to advocate for its continued availability.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Julie. We really appreciate that. That's a great overview. And I think one thing that did come up in the Q&A that I thought I would ask really quick rather than wait for the end. There was a question about Hurricane Helene relief in Southwest Virginia. And do you foresee any chance that that could come up as part of some of that pass-through money?
I don't know. I have not heard about that. What I do know is that on the federal level, there are efforts underway to provide emergency supplemental funding through the Historic Preservation Fund. And some folks on this call may remember that DHR received roughly around $7 million in response to Hurricane Florence and Michael. And so something similar to that is a possibility.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I know there were some historic communities in that part of the state that were adversely affected. So, and with that, we're going to introduce Trip Pollard, who is the chair of the Public Policy Committee here at Preservation Virginia. And he's also with Southern Environmental Law Center as part of his day job here in Richmond. So thank you, Trip. And we also have Zach LeMaster with Gentry, Locke, a government relations director there who is working with Preservation Virginia really for the first time this fall, but it's been great working with you, Zach. So fellas, I'll go ahead and share the slides here. And folks, if y'all are having any trouble seeing these, just let me know. Let's see here.
Excellent. Thanks, Will. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Will mentioned, I'm the chair of Preservation Virginia's Policy Committee. And next slide, Will. I'd like to begin with a quick recap of last session. There was massive, almost unprecedented turnover in the General Assembly when they convened for the 24th session, certainly the largest in recent memory. And then there were also a new speaker, a new Senate Majority Leader, new Minority Leader, almost all new committee chairs in the Senate, and all new committee chairs in the House. So we had a lot of education to do to kind of help get new members up to speed on priority preservation issues last session. And I'm pleased to say that there were some important preservation issues that did move forward last session. For one thing, the historic rehab tax credit that Director Langan was just talking about, the amount an individual can deduct each year was increased from 5 to 7.5 million. The downside of that is it created some pressure to cap the credit, which would have some adverse effects that I'll say more about in a minute. But we and our partners were ultimately able to defeat the cap. There was also a number of important budget items like funding for the Virginia 250 Fund, and Preservation Virginia received some funding for historic Jamestown, which I'll say more about that in a bit as well. There were also a number of important policy provisions. One we supported for several sessions that finally passed specifies greater consultation with tribes in Virginia on the impact of proposed permits on natural, cultural, and historic resources. So that's a quick look at last session. I'll turn it over to Zach to give you some flavor of what the upcoming session is likely to be like.
Thank you, Trip. And just real quick, as Will said, Government Affairs Director with Gentry, Locke Consulting. Happy to be working with Preservation Virginia. In a previous life, I was Senator Norman's office for 8 years. And obviously that district was anchored in the historic Triangle district, so very familiar with the important work of that preserving our history is from work down there. But this upcoming session is as always, going to be a fun one. We're heading into a governor's election and lieutenant governor and attorney general, so we've got some statewide elections that are going to be highlighted and probably will color a lot of the discussions that are coming out this year, including obviously the presidential election. We anticipate a lot of discussions on bills that will be responses to potential initiatives from the federal government. All 100 members of the House of Delegates will be up later this year. Many of the freshmen that Tripp had talked about are going into their first reelection and are really going to learn how to balance out their brochure items, if you will, and local initiatives with maybe some things that actually need to get done. When you enter an election year of this nature, some of um, the talking points and discussions that happen at the General Assembly can be a little bit more divisive and partisan in nature, and it does sometimes limit the number of bills that can really functionally get done at times. We do anticipate there being some major discussions on data centers, which I know Tripp, I believe, is talking about later. Some casino discussions, solar siting, artificial intelligence, potentially some discussions on Reggie, although most of that will probably be still in the courts. And there was a lot of discussions last year about the Virginia Military Survivor and Education Program, which could have some drastic impacts on what additional funds are available in the budget, as that'll certainly be a priority for both parties. But when you look at these major issues, even if they're not directly related to Preservation Virginia's initiatives, they could they could end up having indirect impacts on discussions that go on in the General Assembly. As Julie had said, there is probably going to be more of a focus on one-time spending. You have a governor that's going to, in his last term, in last General Assembly session, and so that'll probably be a focus on getting one-time spending out the door and not adding recurring costs for both sides wanting to focus on more recurring costs in the future next year. Even with all the turnover that we had last year, there's still additional turnover expected. We had the elections in November, where some of the members in the General Assembly will now be going to DC. And while there will probably not be a change in the dynamics as far as which party is in charge, it'll be different personalities that we're dealing with. Delegate Srinivasan is probably going to be moving to the Senate. Um, Senator John McGuire is becoming a congressman, and we're waiting to see who the nominees will be there. And then it is expected that J.J. Singh will probably be the delegate replacing Srinivasan in the House. So more education efforts will need to be had with those new members who will be elected January 7th, the day before we gavel in. So anticipate a lot of discussion on kind of like the brochure bills you would expect: abortion, elections rights, gun rights, to really dominate the news media as members kind of uh, get themselves in a position for elections later this year.
So thanks, Zach, for that color commentary and overview.
Yeah.
So turning now to our specific priorities for next session, a top priority will be defending the historic rehabilitation tax credit. As Julie mentioned, this has been an incredibly successful tool, saving resources and revitalizing communities throughout the Commonwealth. And next slide will. She also mentioned the study that we do. One of the indicators of just how successful this program is it found that the credit had, with $1.7 billion of credits, generated $6.8 billion of private investment. So this is an incredibly effective tool from an economic development as well as a historic preservation perspective. So if you could go back one, Will. As I mentioned last session, the amount a taxpayer can claim each year was significantly increased. And that did generate discussion of something we faced a number of times before, which are proposals to cap the tax credit. The reason we are so opposed to that, as many of you know, is it would limit rehabilitation efforts, especially by those who are less well off, and create a chilling effect on preservation across the board. So we're trying to head off any efforts to cap the program, and then we will fight against any that arise in the coming session. Okay, next slide, Will. A second priority for us will be the funding for historic Jamestown. Flooding and sea level rise are increasingly impacting this irreplaceable site. In fact, really the future of the site, from the historic landscape to archaeological resources and even just access to the site, are all at risk. We need to act quickly to save Jamestown, and we also are raising some private funds for this. We've gotten some money from the state, but we need more. And so we are going to be seeking some additional funds in the upcoming session. And next slide. Our other budget priorities, a number of them Director Langan mentioned. So we'll be supporting DHR's requests, which hopefully will all get into the governor's budget. As was mentioned, that is released December 18th. And if some of those things aren't in the governor's budget, hopefully we can find some legislators who will put them in, because I think they're just some critical needs for DHR. And Julie also mentioned a number of other pots of money that may or may not be in the governor's budget. The Virginia 250 Fund, the BIPOC Fund, African American Cemetery, all of those, I think, if they're not in the governor's budget, there will be budget amendments introduced by members, and Preservation Virginia will be supporting those. She also mentioned another one I forgot to include on the slide, which is the proposed, because it's a new one, as the Great Outdoors Act, which would provide dedicated funding for parks, a number of open space and land conservation funds, as well as historic preservation. And Preservation Virginia is a member of the coalition working to pass that. Next slide. So if it sounds like I'm talking a lot about money, it's because that is going to be a central focus this session. As was mentioned, we've got a budget surplus, and that definitely will put a lot of the focus on money. But there are some important policy issues that are going to be taken up in the next session. And one of the most significant for the preservation community is the issue of data centers. There were a host of bills last session. None passed as the General Assembly largely punted to await the results of a study by JLARC. That's the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, which is sort of the independent arm of the General Assembly that does research on key issues. They've got a report coming out on data centers. It's due actually next week. We'll see what it says. But we definitely expect that there will be a fair number of bills this session dealing with data centers. At the very least, I think the tax incentive needs to be narrowed to be more selective, if not eliminated altogether. We have kind of an outdated policy in Virginia right now that's giving a lot of tax revenue away. And also there may be some bills of particular interest to Preservation Virginia and folks on this webinar to address and try to help address the impact of proposed data centers on historic resources. So we'll see what we get along those lines next session, and how that discussion goes remains to be seen, but we certainly are looking for some reforms to. We'll continue to have many more data centers in Virginia, but we just want to make sure they're appropriately cited. So next slide, Will. So those are our top priorities, and I'll turn it over to Zach to talk a little bit more about the process for next session.
Yeah, as has been stated a lot of time, multiple times already, December 18th is really the next big date everyone is waiting for, when the governor's budget will be released. It'll be obviously a surprise to everyone what is in it, and we will all frantically read through however many pages that'll be, several hundred pages. After that, we will begin the process of identifying any kind of members that we need for budget amendments. January 8th is when session actually gavels in. And then January 10th will be the deadline at 5 p.m. for us to secure and submit any kind of budget amendments. Normally what happens is that following Tuesday after submissions, members will receive the official copy of they have requested from finance staff, so they can approve it officially, and then we'll really go further into, and it'll be made public probably that Tuesday or Wednesday afterwards. So we'll really understand what members have requested, and if there's other additional things that we need to support that maybe members did on their own as well. This is a quote unquote short session. So that means we are going to be there, I think 46 days. So we'll be ending later in February. Obviously in recent years, we've had some issues with the General Assembly being able to end on time and having extended special sessions. As I mentioned earlier, it is an election year, so I would anticipate members will be very excited to leave on time with a budget, and so they can go and do other things with their time. So I would not anticipate, hopefully, any special sessions this year. And again, ending in early February. What that really means is the bulk of the work that we need to do is really at February 4th, which is going to be roughly around where crossover is. You've got to get both chambers and their budgets in place so that your budget requests are going to be in both sides of the budget. If you're in one or the other, it becomes a challenge because then you're really at the negotiating table and at the whims of the members of the finance committees. That we are going to be doing ongoing engagement during session. I think we're going to be having weekly calls, I believe, on Fridays, and there will be action alerts when there are specific issues that are popping up, so we can make sure that we notify you if you sign up for those, to where a bill is coming up in committee, or if there's a budget amendment that we need people to rally around to contact members. So there will be constant updates and engagements with members. And I believe we're having some Monday weekly updates as well. So Will can correct me on the dates of those, but there will be weekly engagements to make sure you're up to date on everything, as well as specific alerts to issues when they pop up. And our Trip, is this you or me?
We could do a little of both. So
Okay.
I can,
Monday,
I
that's what it
can
was.
I'll go ahead and take it. So as I mentioned, the alerts, so encourage you to sign up for those. You mentioned the updates. But also let us know if you take action or hear back from your legislature. And then we will also be doing a session wrap up when things are over. And so next slide. So encourage you all to get involved. Follow our work at preservationvirginia.org. Sign up for those alerts, track our website updates, and also really hope you can attend and consider sponsoring. We have our annual legislative reception this year. Will be this session next year will be January 29th. It'll be actually in downtown Richmond. It's a great way to catch up with fellow preservationists, the administration, legislators, and also if you or any folks or businesses would be interested in sponsoring, this is key to raising money for our advocacy work every year. So I hope you can attend, and whether at the reception or elsewhere, also really encourage you to please engage with your legislature. So going to be a busy session, and thank you all for tuning in today. I'll turn it back over to Will.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Trip and Zach. And actually, Karen Daly made a good comment in the chat there that the Virginia Association of Museums is having their lobby day on January 29th as well. And that's in the morning and during the day. And then after that, we're hoping a big contingent of VAM will come over to the legislative reception. So it's really a wonderful way to spend your whole January 29th advocating for historic places. So thanks for that, Karen. We appreciate it. So we're going to jump right into the Q&A here. We have a few questions for the panel that I'm going to throw out there to y'all. And I'm going to start with Julie Langan. So Julie, there was a question about how DHR, as of the last few months, is using a new grant portal system for grant requests online. And I think it was just a general question about the type of system that is and how that might work going forward, and if it's going well for DHR.
Thank you for the question. Yes, it is going well. It was a considerable amount of effort to get it up and running, but it's called Web Grants, and it is the same system that a number of other state agencies are using. So it facilitates people applying for state grants and having uniformity in how they apply. So going forward, if someone's applying for a cemetery grant or a battlefield grant or a BIPOC grant, really doesn't matter which one it is, they're going to use the same Web Grants portal, and it will look the same, feel the same. And I think once people use it, they will be very enthusiastic about it. It also makes it easier for us to track projects and communicate with grantees.
That's great, Julia. We've had some experience with it already, and we thought it worked really smooth, and it's great to just have everything digital now. It's easy to go back and pull things or historic requests and things like that. So congrats to your team for implementing that system. And And we had a question from our good friend Susie Ellicott about the data center study from JLARC. Is that study going to be made accessible to the public immediately, or is it just to members and then comes out later? How does that work?
Well, all JLARC studies are public, and they all are published and available on the JLARC website. They do not always come out immediately upon them being given to General Assembly, but usually they're pretty fast about getting them up.
Great. Good to know. Zach, did you want to add to that?
No, the only thing I was going to say is I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Trip, I think Monday is the JLARC meeting where they should be presenting that report.
Yep.
Okay. Sure. I think we're all really interested to see what they came up with. It's a big issue. So we also talked about how there could be a possible cap on the historic tax credit program, really just based on some conversations that happened last session. The question is, does there seem to be any talk or buzz about that already? Specifically, should we be speaking to local legislators about this issue in the next few weeks?
Yeah, go ahead, Trip.
All right, I'll start. You can add on. So
Okay.
I mean, it's last session. This is a perennial issue, but last session it really got a lot more attention because of the increase in the individual deduction, and it actually was a cap was temporarily added by a subcommittee, and we were ultimately able to defeat it working with our partners. But it clearly showed, I think, that is still a live issue, and we have heard some discussion about it. Have not heard any specifics yet that any particular legislator is going to propose a cap this session. But I think the chances are fairly high that it'll at least be discussed, and it will be on the table. So on the second part of the question, absolutely. I think it's great to start contacting your legislators about it now. We've begun to meet, Preservation Virginia have begun to meet with legislators as well as staff of the committees that help write the budget. They help members to using the study that Director Langan mentioned. It provides some great evidence of just how important and how successful this tax credit has been. So we've been working to educate folks and try to head off at the pass as much as we can, any effort to put a cap on the table, but it's very likely to be at some level in the discussions next session.
Yeah, just to add to that, a lot of members right now are still in the process of setting their legislative agenda. Right before Thanksgiving, they had their deadline to submit for pre-filing. The number you can request for drafts of bills is much higher than the number that you can actually put in. There is a cap on, and I don't remember the number. I think it's about 15 bills or so, 15 or 20 bills that members are going to be allowed to introduce. With those caps, it is helpful in limiting some of these discussions, and all in part because what we talked about earlier, a lot of members are going to be focused on election, we'll say level bills, things that are important to the local jurisdictions. And so we've had those preliminary discussions. We're going to keep having them. If we hear anything specific and concrete, we can certainly let everyone know, and we'll fire up the alerts and get ready. But we've not heard a specific item yet.
It's great. Yeah, it's just best to get out in front of these conversations while we can. And Julie, I imagine DHR's really thorough study on the impacts of historic tax credits is available on your website. Folks can access it there.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Right. Could be a good tool to, print that out, at least the executive summary out, and take that to some of your meetings with your local elected officials. So then we had one question about the DHR VA 250th grants, Julie, and I do believe the responses, the answers about who's going to receive those grants will be later this month. Is that right?
We are hoping to announce by the end of December, early January. We're actually in pretty good shape to achieve that timeline. I had a meeting just this morning going over some of the preliminary evaluations and recommendations. So I think we'll get there by then. Yeah.
That's great. But the idea of future funding, to follow up on that question, Julie, we're not sure yet. That's not necessarily in the budget yet. Yeah.
No, if I were to guess, I would say that it will be in the budget somewhere, either because the governor puts a little additional funding in, or because of perhaps even multiple budget amendments. But we'll all just have to be patient and wait and see.
Sure. And I do believe that there's a federal version of the 250th grants that at least came out last winter. I haven't seen an alert about that yet, but it could be in the next month or so. We'll hear about a federal level grant program that's very similar. So we'll just have to keep our eyes peeled. So, and Tripp, you and I might have to answer this. There was one question about with Jamestown and the funding there. Just clarification about the fact that we are on an island surrounded by the National Park Service, and just questions about federal support versus state support. I think it always helps to kind of clarify our role at Jamestown, but just to say that we do own 22.5 acres that include the original 1607 James Fort site. Preservation Virginia was gifted that land in 1893. And then the Park Service purchased the remaining portions of Jamestown Island, I think in the 1920s, to preserve that historic landscape. So at this time, we are leaning pretty hard on state support to help us with this project. Most, if not all, of the work to preserve Jamestown from the flooding issues will take place on Preservation Virginia land, and not so much on Park Service property at this time. But Tripp, do you want to add to that?
I think that's exactly right. The only thing I would add is part of the reason for that focus is the urgency of the need. Federal money tends to move a lot slower. So that's part of the reason why we're focused on private fundraising and state money more than federal. Although we certainly haven't closed the door to seeking some federal funds, it just tends to come with a lot more strings and come more slowly.
Sure. And you and someone, unfortunately, the worst impacts of the flooding seems to be on our parcel there. We're seeing the worst recurrent flooding, so we're having to move on this as fast as we possibly can. And so how about one last question, if that's okay? We had a question about the individual cap per taxpayer for historic tax credit projects. Do we anticipate that coming back down as almost a negotiation, in a sense that it went up to 7.5 million per project last term? Could that come down in lieu of a cap?
That's definitely possible. So that is, if the assembly feels the session, they have to act somewhere. In some ways, the easiest thing is to reverse what they did last session. So that may well be on the table. Absolutely. Wouldn't speculate, but last session they did increase that amount, and the cap discussion then was on the overall program. So if they are uncomfortable, kind of doubting they would hopefully do something too fast, but because it was on the table and got as far as it did last session, I think it will be on the table again. And I think that in addition to overall cap, yes, it is also possible they would revisit the individual amount as well.
No, thank you, Tripp. And I'm sorry, actually, one last quick question. We did get a great one from Connie Rosemont here about Virginia tourism, and it's just a great sort of another angle to take before we break up here today. Are there synergies between advocacy for Virginia tourism and historic preservation in terms of coming together to elevate and promote historic sites, either from a DHR or state level? I do think with the Virginia 250th anniversary coming up, that there is probably more synergy than ever before, at least in my experience in museums, where Virginia is prioritizing historic sites for tourism dollars and national promotions. But is that the sense you get, Julie?
Yes, absolutely. And Virginia Tourism Corporation, as well as DHR, have seats on the Virginia 250 Commission. And so we are working in coordination, making plans for what we hope will be a tremendous increase in visitation, not just in 2026, but leading up to it and following after.
Sure. We owned Patrick Henry's house where he wrote the Give Me Liberty speech. So that big anniversary is March of 2025. So we hope you all will put that on your calendar. So we're a little bit out front of some of the other 250th events for sure. But I believe that's all the questions we have today. And first of all, I want to thank our amazing panel for taking time for this. it's a really busy month for all three of you, especially with General Assembly coming and the holidays. But I can tell you at Preservation Virginia, we really appreciate your expertise and partnership as we navigate these issues over the next few months. And certainly me personally, as the new CEO, as I'm still learning some of these things, but it's been exciting to pick up where our wonderful longtime leader, Elizabeth Castelny, left off. But for everyone who attended, we had a great group. I think about 50 people hung in there the whole time, which is great. Again, thank you for spending your lunch breaks with us. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me or any of the folks on the panel here about how we can help you in some of your local preservation efforts. But please do register for our legislative alerts. You can find that in the Congressional and General Assembly advocacy page of our website. We will send those out every Monday during session to keep you up to date as to what's happening with our bill and amendment monitoring. And also, please register for the legislative reception. We are moving it to a new location this year. We thought we'd mix it up and try something new, but it's a newer event space on 6th and Franklin Streets, as Tripp mentioned, a block closer to the Capitol. So we'll see if we can get some folks to walk down after their committees end and such from the General Assembly. But we do need support. This kind of work, it's not free. We do commit a lot of our resources to make sure we're monitoring and pushing for positive preservation policy on all levels of government, really. But at the end of the day, we're all on the same team, and we appreciate your support as we move forward. But have a great holiday season from all of us at Preservation Virginia, and we hope to see you on January 29th at the legislative reception. Thanks, everybody. I think that'll do it today. Take care.